Lynn, the first question comes from Ireland, from one of the leaders of Sinn Féin, and he says, Mr. LaRouche, let me first preface my remarks by expressing both my personal gratitude and the gratitude of the entire Sinn Féin organization, both here in the North and also in the South, both to you and to Dr. Freeman, oh, that's so nice, for not only supporting us as we've resisted the efforts of the British Empire to further enslave the Irish people, but also for your continued wise advice. And I hope that I may impose upon you once again. As you know, we had hoped for the successful defeat of the insistence that the inter-alpha group banks be saved at the expense of the Irish people and the Irish nation. And although that first battle was temporarily lost, I'm very confident that in short order, this current government will fall and the passage of that heinous capitulation rescinded. Yes, of that we are most confident. But my question to you is this. Once that is done, what do we do next? We are not the United States. We have never had a sovereign banking system. We barely have a sovereign republic. And we really do need some guidance as to how to proceed.
Well, as you may have picked up from my reading of this material, which I put on the record for the obvious reason, in that way. Now, once we have assumed that we've gotten rid of this British problem, because, and I said, it's the British Empire. The British Empire, we are, in dealing with, as people in Ireland will, of course, some tend to understand, we are a product, or had been until recently, more recently. We had been originally a product of primarily the British Isles. We had been people who come to what became the United States from across the waters, generally from Europe. We brought with us a European culture, but we brought with us a mission given to us by Nicholas of Cusa, the founder of modern science and modern civilization, to go across the waters to get away from what was going on in Europe, but not to destroy Europe, but to create an alternative for European culture and others in the seas across the ocean. This has been Cusa's destiny, which has been picked up specifically by Christopher Columbus. And so, in between us and Europe, while we have people from other parts of the world, from Asia in particular, in increasing quantities inside the United States, the same thing holds true. When people go from one climate to another climate, they don't change the nature of being people, they change the way they adapt to the climate. And this applies to political climates as well. Europe is dominated to the present day, from the time of the founding of the Roman Empire, has been dominated by an empire. And as I indicated earlier today, the Roman Empire, which finally got itself together on the Isle of Capri, with this famous Octavian, who became known as Augustus Caesar, or Disgusting Caesar, or whatever. Since that time, Europe has been dominated by an imperial monetarist system, which was established originally as a Mediterranean system under the Caesars. Right? Now, this empire went through crises, but the empire persisted. The center of the empire shifted. Rome collapsed. But what happened? Byzantium arose. Byzantium, about 1000 AD, collapsed. But then the Venetian power arose. In fact, what had happened is with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Roman oligarchy, the aristocracy of Rome, had moved up to swamp areas, which is more accommodating to their nature. But They moved up there in the area which we call Venice today, because being up there with their wealth and treasures taken with them, they presumed they would be reasonably secure, hidden and protected by swamps from people coming to steal their precious treasures. So they became a financial power. They were power partly inside the Byzantine system up there. When they got a new status, they suddenly established themselves with greater authority. And when Byzantium began to disintegrate, then Venice made itself independent, and Venice used its own control over the monetarist system of the Mediterranean and beyond to dominate Europe as an empire. That collapsed in the new Dark Ages of the 14th century. Out of that came a great struggle. You had a Renaissance led by Cusa and people like that. But then we had a long period of religious warfare from 1492 to 1648, in which Europe largely destroyed itself. And during this period, elements of the European Renaissance, the 15th century Renaissance, elements of that moved across the water, according to Cusa's prescription, and they arrived in significant numbers in North America. Now, the southern part in South America didn't work out too well because the Habsburgs were controlling that part of the world, and the British system was. But we in North America, as Europeans at that time, had a European cultural basis. Our language, our literature, our music, and so forth were all essentially European. But when we crossed the water and we hit freedom on the other shore, we began to behave differently. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the center and origin of this process. So since that time, we always had a trans-Pacific orientation. We believed that we must move and establish this entire continent, the North American continent, as a continent divided between the Canadian border and the Mexican border. That's been our policy all along. And our intention was to cross the Pacific to establish cooperative relations with people on the other side of the Pacific. And so it goes. But in this process of change, as we have a greater part of the Pacific-oriented Asian population in the United States, the same principle remains true. We are a people who have our culture. We distinguish the political characteristics of our constitutional system from the European systems, which have an inferior political culture, because they are the slaves, in a sense, of an empire, which is today the British Empire. And it is a British Empire. It's an international system. It's not an empire as most children think. It's an empire of a system, of a monetary system. And whoever controls the monetary system and is able to determine the relative values of monetary values, thus rules an empire. You see what's happening now. The Inter-Alpha Group, which is a bankrupt organization, is the British Empire. It's a totally bankrupt institution. As you know, Brazil is about to go down to the toilet, if it's lucky. It may go directly to the warmer place. You know. But the point is, the whole system is coming down. Now, therefore, looking at Ireland, what's the prospect for Ireland? Well, I've made a reference in these remarks to constitutional kinds of remarks, to the role of England. What would England do without the empire? Suppose we take every sinking bank in England and we wipe it out, or it wipes itself out, which is pretty well on the road to doing. What do we do with the English people? What do we do with the Scots? What do you do with the Welsh? What do you do with the English? What do you do with the Irish? Well, now, in far as the United Kingdom, we can deal with that. If every bank in England goes bankrupt, that's not a tragedy, that's a triumph. But what do we throw the British people into the sewer? Or do we do something else? Why don't we just give them a commercial banking system like our own commercial banking system? And they can do just fine. They'll do better. Now, what's going to happen, presuming we get through this crisis, is the world is going to change. one thing that must happen out of this process, the British Empire, as I've defined it here and on other occasions, must be eliminated. Now, the problem with the British Empire, like all empires, is empires have always, in known history, the known history of mankind, of civilizations and nations as such, goes back to the melting of the great glaciation. And this went on, and suddenly we had the emergence of a system, the waters of the oceans rose by 400 feet as the glaciers melted. You could get in through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. At a later point, you had a freshwater lake, which was a glacial melting lake called the Black Sea, we call the Black Sea today. It was on a lower level, and one day the salt water of the Mediterranean broke through the Dardanelles and put a layer of salt water on top of the Black Sea. So the seas rose by about 400 feet on the mean. So now the melting of the glaciers, the life of mankind on the planet changed. What had been the maritime areas were the leading areas of civilization in this period. And so in this process, as the Mediterranean waters rose and the other waters rose, we had a change. The people moved inland, away from the great glaciated areas. The character of the civilization of mankind changed with this change. And so what happened is you had a two-class system came out of this. One was the ruling class. The other, they were called the gods. As in the greatest Greek legends, they called the gods. Right? Why? Because they call themselves gods. And the others were the slaves. So you had the function, the history has been, which is the British Empire today. Prince Philip, for example, with his World Wildlife Fund, still expresses this policy, is that you must keep the people, the mass of people down. Now, in order to keep the population reduced, you've got to lower technology. You've got to stupefy the people. You've got to limit the number of them. That's called environmentalism. It's evil. It's a hatred of human beings, of saying, we, the rich and wealthy and powerful, we run the planet, and we got to keep the numbers of these people down. We keep the numbers down and we keep them stupid. We don't let them have nuclear power. We tell them to have wind power. Don't stand behind them. So now we're coming into a period where presumably coming out of this great crisis, which the British Empire will be destroyed, what do we do with the planet? Well, we have ideas in China, which are very good ideas. You don't have to get into all the details about whether you like it or not. That's not the point. But China's on the way up. China is going into nuclear and thermonuclear power. It's going into space, and so forth. India has a similar movement. It's a different characteristic. You have other parts of the world. You have Africa, a whole continent which has been abused and destroyed. Well, what are we going to do with this world now that we've ended oligarchism? Now we're going to have to get back to work. What's the problem in India? Well, the Indians are labor force is half as productive as the Chinese labor force. Why? Because of a long history of their social system. Terrible poverty. They don't have skills. It's not that they can't produce, they just don't have the skills. So therefore, our job is going to be to take areas of the world which are underdeveloped, where people are underdeveloped, as in the continent of Africa and elsewhere, as in the struggles in Asia to better things. We're going to have to organize, bring mankind to a higher level of physical productivity and a standard of culture. Well, now what do we do then? Now put Ireland, the Ireland era, in this situation. What are we talking about? Well, the Irish and the Americans tend to get along pretty well. We have a lot of Irish in the United States, Irish ancestry. I got a bit myself, you know. Yeah, some great-grandfather layers. So a lot of people have Irish in them, especially in the Americas. So what we're going to do is essentially, our job is to look at areas where nations and people of those nations have the ability to participate in a cooperative venture for improvement of the conditions of life of the planet as a whole. Now, Ireland has no problem with that. And if, I have some Scottish ancestors too. They would have a problem, but that's all right. So therefore, what we need is to set up essentially what the United States was intended to be, was to get out from under these slave systems in which we divided people into the overclass and the underclass. Now we've got to develop humanity. There's no other way you can develop this planet, life on this planet. So now we're going to have a division of labor. In every part of the world where we can find people who are qualified to do work of a certain skill level, and it's the appropriate kind of work for them, it's our interest to have an international system of the type that Hamilton projected for the United States in national banking. What we're going to do is take a mercantile type of banking, which is the proper type of banking for any self-respecting nation. We're going to organize the mercantile banking system as under the protection and facilitation of a national banking system for any country. In other words, we don't have these outside imperial banks, these monetarist banks. We have credit system-based banks, which the United States is designed to be. So we're going to have to do that now in the United States. We're going to have to reestablish the third national bank of the United States to get out of this mess we're in now. Other nations will want to do the same kind of thing, having a national authority, which is that represents the private interests, generally, with government cooperation, of what we call a commercial banking system. And it's going to be a credit system as well as a commercial banking system. So now what are we going to do? We're going to put out the work to those who are able to take it on. And, Scotland will probably split from England on the basis of this crisis. So now you'll have 3 nations up there. I don't know what the Welsh will do. But anyway, there'll be a little different arrangement up there in that vicinity of the world than there is today. And so I think if Ireland can be constituted as a secured republic, not one who is not being abused in some way, then Ireland has a skilled population and a culture which can obviously produce things. And therefore, the answer is to create that system of international cooperation, which is what Roosevelt had intended for the United Nations, which we never got because he died, and other people had a different idea. So our view should be the United Nations, not the way they're trying to do it now, but simply the idea that sovereign nations on this planet have to have a credit system because development involves several successive generations. Anything we're going to do in this century on a rational basis is going to take the better part of a century. We're talking about 3-4 generations, 4 generations of people. So this 4-generation interval is going to be involved in investments which have maturities of 30, 50, 100 years. Look at even the changes in the 20th century. Take the beginning of the 20th century. Flight by aircraft. Think of all the other technological changes which occurred in the span of a century, in a very bad behaving century. So now that we have the same thing, so we need We need the ability for long-term credit among nations. We're going to have to develop all of Asia. That's going to take more than a century. We're going to have to develop Asia with sovereign nation states in Asia. It's going to require cooperation with the world as a whole. We need a system of the type that Roosevelt intended for the post-war period. We need a League of Nations, a real one. We need a United Nations in that form. So therefore, if we have a United Nations, we're going to create an international system of credit like a fixed exchange rate system among nations. Because nations are going to have to help each other, as in Asia. You have up to a century of development to reach the level of true parity and security. You have credit that has to be extended from one part of the world to the other. So therefore, you have to have a stable international credit system of the type that Roosevelt envisaged. Now, this is coming on now. We're either going to survive this thing this year, early this year, or we're not. And if we're not going to survive it, you're going to have very damn few people on this planet if we don't. So therefore, we have to do it. We have to cut the mustard down. And what's the situation for Ireland? It's fine. Fine. And especially what the Irish are doing now in reasserting their long-fought desire for sovereignty is perfect for it. So therefore, it'll just have plenty of market for what Ireland can do as its products. But there has to be a system under which we can discuss exactly those things and make it work. There are opportunities everywhere. And I've got some ambitions that go into the next century beyond that. I won't be around for it, but I still can have that ambition for that. So that's the point. We have obviously, we're going to come out of this thing with a struggle to establish what Roosevelt had intended by his idea of what was a League of Nations. Nations which are perfectly sovereign, respectively, have their own national cultures, but are free of monetarism, who operate on the basis of national credit systems. And the national credit systems have to form what Roosevelt did, a fixed exchange rate system among national credit systems. We're going to talk about up to a century of development to change this planet, do the repair job on this planet that imperialism has left. We're going to do it with sovereign nation states, with promoting language cultures, existing sovereign language cultures, and so forth. And we already have enough experience to know how to do that from our experience. I see the prospects for, well, the very fact that the Irish are fighting is their greatest asset. Sometimes it may be the greatest detriment, but in this case, I think it's their greatest asset. Because it had the ties to the United States, the psychological ties of Ireland to the United States are sufficient to be very useful for this purpose. I see no great problem. I see a practical problem, but it's a practical problem that we and Ireland share together as a common problem of nations around the world today.